All right, today what we have for you is a video giving you kind of an overall explanation of Aperture cards. And what are Aperture cards? First question. Well, they're part of the microform family. So in microforms, there's microfilm, microfiche, and Aperture cards. So Aperture cards are a type of microform, typically 35 millimeter microfilm inside of a hole, like a square. It's called an aperture. The hole or the aperture will be on this side, and the card will be about this big, like 3x7, and it's a cardboard kind of or cardstock-ish material, kind of a beige color typically, although we've seen orange, like a faded orange or a light blue, kind of a pastel blue. But typically it's just kind of a beige color cardstock where you have the card and the aperture, the square, is on that side, and inside of that is a 35 millimeter microfilm image. Now the types of Aperture cards are, there's the standard, which is just that cardstock with the aperture in there, and again, typically it's a 35 millimeter image, which will be like an engineering drawing, maybe photographing a piece of microfilm of an oversized book. And also to mention, the way they get that image in there, that piece of microfilm, is typically you make an entire roll of microfilm and then you cut them up and you put the individual images inside that Aperture card. However, inside that frame, instead of having one image, you might have multiple small images, like office-sized docs, but they're all photographed in one picture and then put in that microfilm. So that's another type of Aperture card you could have that would require a little extra effort to create the individual images as a digital file. And then you also might have some really weird stuff where there's like multiple channels horizontally or vertically, where you have 16 millimeter images in those channels. Again, those are more rare, but it does happen. But another type that can also throw a little twist into Aperture cards is what's called holograph, and that's when the card itself, the actual card stock, has little hole punches in it. And what those hole punches do are they, in most cases, represent what's on the title block. So you have the card like this, you have the aperture over here, and then you have the title block, like the strip across the top, that'll say something like project number, revision number, date, address, things like that. But if you have a bunch of hole punches just all over the card, that's what's called holograph. And what you can actually do is use a special scanner where you put it through the scanner, only the aperture, only the microfilm image gets captured, but then the scanner actually reads those hole punches and spits out the index information, the naming information. So that is another method of scanning, instead of scanning the whole card and the image and then doing some keying or digital naming after. If you have a holograph card scanner, you can just put it right through and then it'll actually just create the digital file name for you. Now, how to count your Aperture cards can be very simple or it can be a little more laborious, but if you have something like maybe a couple dozen, couple hundred, you can count them by hand. If you're contacting a company like ours, just count them out, say, I have 173. Okay, great. Or I have 95. Perfect. But as you start getting a couple hundred, couple thousand, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, cabinets full, you're not gonna wanna count them by hand. So what you can do is what's called pinch and inch. And what you basically do is, if you have your cards, let's say you have a couple cabinets full, pull out a drawer, they're stacked together, measure an inch, take a ruler and measure an inch, pull out that inch, and count those cards. You're probably gonna have somewhere around 100, roughly. But count whatever that is, and then figure out how many inches total you have of Aperture cards. So if each drawer has a certain number of inches and you have multiple drawers, just put those together, use some general math, and then extrapolate the number. So if you have something like 200 inches of cards, and you measured 100 per inch in that specific inch you measured, then you'd have about 20,000 Aperture cards. Again, it's rough numbers, but you're not gonna be counting them individually. And for someone like us or a company like BMI that's gonna scan them, we just need ballparks so we're in the right area. So we're not thinking, okay, you have 50,000 cards, but you really have 10,000. We wanna have a pretty decent idea, but it doesn't have to be super specific. So pinch and inch is what it's called. Now we're on to the cost of scanning, or what the price is gonna be for you to digitize your cards. And it's gonna completely depend on, do you have standard, do you have holograph, do you have a single 35 millimeter image or multiple 60 millimeter images? Do you have a single aperture, or are there multiple channels that we have to do more cropping and special scanning? How are you gonna name the files? Again, could it be holograph indexing? Or do we have to go to the image? Is there a title strip? Or it's a standard card with no title strip, we have to go to the image. All these things are gonna play into what your cost is gonna be. But in general, you're looking about 20 cents to 50 cents. So if you have a lot of cards and it's a pretty simple project, you're gonna be closer to the 20 cents. If it's fewer cards or more complex, you're gonna be closer to 50 cents. But it really depends on your specific project. So to get an accurate quote, you should contact a company like BMI or just contact us. Tell us what you want to do with that project and we can walk you through some different options, solutions, and prices for that project. All right, now we're gonna get into a little more nuance. So the framing and cropping, that's what we call it. It's when you have an image, so you have the card, you scan the card, or we scan it, that's one method. And then we also scan the individual frame that includes that microfilm image, but you'll probably have border. So there's the aperture, let's say it's like this big, but then there's the actual image that's like that. What's called framing or cropping is if you don't want that extra border that includes the entire frame, it's removing that border around the image. So that's called framing or cropping. Very simple for just a single 35mm image. But if you have those multiple smaller images or multiple channels, either horizontal or vertically, it gets a little more nuanced and a little more difficult because you have to find the images. Maybe they're not perfectly consistent aligned. You have an image like this or one like this. It happens. So depending on the actual cards, the actual images, framing and cropping can be very simple, or it might add a little bit to that cost that we talked about earlier, which is part of your specific project. And now we move into indexing, which is also basically called digital naming. And as I mentioned before, let's say you have a standard Aperture card, just standard card, there's no hole punches. You have the image over here, you have the title block. The most typical ways to replicate what you have on that title strip at the top. Maybe there's one field or two fields or three fields. So you might have an address. Maybe you have an address and a date and a revision number. So depending what's up there, we can capture that and index the file based on that information. If there is no title block and it's a standard Aperture card, no Hall Earth data, then we may have to scan the card and the image and then actually go look at the individual image. That will also be an additional cost because it's not just capturing it from the card as it's scanned. It requires an extra level of going in to start looking around on the microfilm image itself to see what you want named. And that's where you can get a little title blocks can move around, or there can be different information on different images. It gets a little more difficult. But if you have the title strip at top, very consistent. And then of course you have Hall Earth indexing, which if you want that, we put it through the scanner and then it automatically names the file based on the Hall Earth punch data. However, something to consider with Hall Earth cards is when it goes to the scanner, it's gonna spit out whatever it puts out. So however it reads it, that's gonna come out. It could be nice and clean information like, again, street, date, and revision number. But it could also be jumbled or not have good spacing or syntax and whatnot. Or it may just not read it at all. Sometimes that happens. So there are ways to work around that. If it doesn't read it at all, we could of course go to the image again, but then that just adds a little bit of cost. So you just gotta consider the different variations of which type of indexing you want. And then lastly, there's the digital output and the delivery. So how do you actually get the digital files once they're scanned? The first method is what I call, or what we call, the traditional method. So if you think of scanning files, hard copies, you think JPEGs, TIFFs, PDFs. Very basic. Typically you're gonna do one, let's say PDF per card, and scan the cards. You have 20,000 cards, you're gonna get 20,000 PDFs. Potentially you might want to merge files. So if they have the exact same, let's say, address and date, but just the different revision numbers, maybe you want to add those two together. So instead of having 20,000 PDFs at the end of the project, you have 17,950 because there were 250 cards that actually had not duplicates but a second revision. So we added those together to the first batch, to the first revision. So things like that you can do. That's a kind of basic output: PDF, TIFFs, JPEGs. Also, we have our digital real secure hosted platform, which actually replicates the card on screen. So what we typically do with digital reel with Aperture cards is we'll scan the card and then scan the microfilm portion separately, and then we'll present the card itself as well as the image. So that gives you a historical context of what's on the card, not just we're saying, hey, here's the film portion image and it's named this. You can actually see the actual card and say, okay, I know I BMI named that, but I want to rename it something else because now I see the card and there's, let's say, handwriting on it. So it's not in the title strip, there might be handwriting or some sort of different piece of information that you want to capture. Having that historical context and being able to globally search all 20,000 cards using a search tool, and you can enhance the images, brightness and contrast, especially with microforms, microfilm, microfiche, Aperture cards. There can be some pretty poor quality images, but in digital reel, you have the ability to actually enhance and adjust the image. So if we give you PDFs, that's kind of it. You have maybe your bitonal, your black and white, and you have your grayscales, but you're not doing a lot of adjustments. You can't do it too well. In digital reel, if you see an image and go, that's not that great, you, the eye of the beholder, have the ability to adjust the image to what's best for you, because it is subjective. The quality is not always objective. So you have that ability in digital reel, plus you get backups. You have a dual location system. We have 2 server areas, so you have automatic backups, access from anywhere, security features, multi-factor authentication, IP locking, all that ties into the digital real version of getting your files. All right, that's a lot about Aperture cards. That's a rundown of what goes into scanning and how it'll affect your project and what you can get after. Now, what you want to do is watch this video for 4 mistakes to avoid when you do a scanning project. Check that out, watch it before you call us, but then call us about your Aperture card project so we can help you get them scanned.